Hello, everybody. How are we doing? I hope you're having a good weekend. Welcome to the first. This is good. Haven't spoken to anyone yet today. Just literally, they're the first words I've actually said out loud, and it just hit me in my head. They're the first words you've said out loud today. That's a bit weird. And then this is what's happened. So, welcome to the first ever This Week in Formula One. It's a series that I'm going to try and do in between the race weekends. Obviously, we're live for qualifying. We're live for the races. We're live for the sprint races on top of that too. But for the weekends that are in between, I want to keep you guys updated on what's going on in the world of Formula One. So this is your comprehensive guide to everything that has happened this week in Formula One and everything you need to keep on top of heading into next weekend, obviously where we're headed to the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix as well. A little breakdown of the biggest news stories, my insight, my personal thoughts and feelings when it comes to the big picture of Formula One, because there's always some crazy stuff that is going to be happening over the course of the Formula One season, and we need to keep ourselves updated on it because Formula One moves so incredibly quickly. Like Bahrain was last weekend, and there's already been 100 news stories about various different people that have come out over the course of this week. There's already been big drama with drivers possibly on the way out. There's been big drama at Ferrari with possibly people leaving there too. There's been shots fired between Red Bull and Aston Martin after the first race of the season. It is all going down already in Formula One. Isn't it just, it's so Formula One that we're back for literally a week and it's already just chaos. It is so wonderful to see. Hello, everybody in the chat. How are we doing? Hello, Jamie. Hello, the Versatile. Hello, Sean. This stream where questions lie for us. What? Well, this is the stream where questions lie for us. I mean, yes, maybe. But we're gonna delve into kind of the biggest news stories of this week and give my sort of thoughts, feelings, a little bit of a roundup and various bits and pieces that are going on in the world of Formula One this week. As I said, we've got Saudi Arabia next week, so there's going to be even more that happens, and there's going to be an absolute madness in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, because we know that Saudi Arabia, for some reason, has become one of the best races. I know we've only been there twice, but both times has been absolutely brilliant, and I'm just really looking forward to Saudi Arabia again. If anything, I feel like it should be a little bit later on in the season. I know that that's a little bit controversial to say because the calendar is already a mess in terms of drivers, cars, teams flying backwards and forwards between continents, and we should really have all of the Grand Prix grouped together if they're in a similar sort of place. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia, when we had it as the penultimate race of that 2021 season, it did add just a little bit of spice, didn't it? Max Verstappen hitting into the wall, the battle between Hamilton, obviously brake testing, Max Verstappen. It was all just very, very exciting. And even last year, I know it was second on the calendar last year as well, but it was still really, really fun. Breaking news, Daniel Ricciardo is happy again. It does feel like Daniel Ricciardo has found a nice little space for himself at the Red Bull team for now. Anyway, shall we actually delve into this week's biggest news stories? I've got 4 news stories I want to go through with you. I think first and foremost, we have to start about... I can't speak today. Really can't speak today. I think first and foremost, we need to start with the possible silly season rumors that have come out after just one Grand Prix, in particular about 2 drivers, Lewis Hamilton and Lando Norris, both of which don't seem very happy in their teams right now, both of which came out after the Bahrain Grand Prix and were slating and also criticizing their team quite heavily moving into this season and don't look very happy with it at all. So let's talk about Lewis Hamilton first, because I feel like Lewis Hamilton is the less likely to really do anything, move anywhere, or kind of come back from this. So Lewis Hamilton, if we kind of look at the news story that broke, he says he knew from the moment that he drove the car, the W14 would need work. And this comes after Lewis Hamilton was actually looking fairly positive about the 2023 season coming into it. You know, you look at all the Mercedes press releases and all of the various bits and pieces he's been talking about sort of before the season, Mercedes seemed fairly happy with their progress. They seemed fairly happy with where they were moving with this concept. Obviously, they held on to the concept that they had over the last couple of seasons, and they seemed like they were happy with it. But Lewis Hamilton supposedly not. It's no secret that Mercedes are unhappy, as it says, about their performance. And he said that, yeah, I knew from the moment I drove the car where we were, the challenges that we would have, that we would be facing. On a positive note, we have the bouncing this year as a huge plus. Trying to understand what problems were there while still having the bouncing really masks so many of those issues. It makes it difficult to figure out what those are. So obviously he's talking about the porpoising, the fact that last season for him was really hard on him in terms of just the physical aspect of Formula One, with that car porpoising so much over the course of the season. There's a buzzword from 2022 that we haven't heard too much over the course of the 2023 season. Remember those 5 races where nobody said any other words other than porpoising? That was very fun. But we do have a few of those now, so we can now focus on pure performance. So I'm encouraged to see that we can focus and encourage everyone in the team. They're so focused on getting us back to the top. We're not where we wanted to start this season naturally, but we're still a multi-championship winning team. And I think that's the thing, right? Lewis Hamilton, at the end of the day, he has won multiple championships with this team. But he did also come out in another interview, there was a little bit less positive. I feel like he's gone for quite a positive sort of viewpoint there after the Bahrain Grand Prix. There was another interview he did later on where he said, I've driven so many cars, I know what a car needs. Right? So he came out and he was quite scathing. And I feel like that kind of pointed many people in the direction of Lewis Hamilton maybe had some thoughts and feelings about the 2022 car, possibly even the 2023 car in the Silverstone test that they did, the Bahrain test that they did. And Lewis Hamilton clearly had some ideas of how to make this car better. And he's not quite getting that back from the Mercedes team at this moment in time, which is quite a juxtaposition, right? Because even after the race, he was very positive on the radio, trying to motivate the team massively in the radio as well. But then it comes to a few interviews, a few different bits and pieces that we've now seen in the media. Hamilton feels very frustrated at the moment. Obviously, he wants to win. I think there's still the remnants of that 2021 championship, the fact that he feels still a little bit broken by that 2021 championship. The fact that he didn't manage to pick up that record-breaking 8th world title. The fact that he's still talked about in that same vein with Michael Schumacher. People still doubt whether or not he is the greatest driver of all time. I do think Lewis Hamilton wants that accolade. I do think Lewis Hamilton chases those individual awards, even though it is within a team sport. He gives me that feeling of a driver who is also stat padding himself. You know what I mean? Like, at the end of the day, there's a few times where he could have just let Valtteri Bottas win a Grand Prix, or let Valtteri Bottas have a pole position where they were looking quite comfortable anyway, but he always tried to get those records and he always kept going throughout the season. I feel like Lewis Hamilton is one of those characters that is chasing those individual accolades within Formula One. And maybe it's just the fact that Mercedes have been a bit stubborn, I would say, in my point of view. I think Mercedes, the fact that they haven't changed direction in 2023, the fact that they seemingly haven't listened to Lewis Hamilton and some of the advice that he wanted to give the team, does put them in this very strange position now, right? Where Lewis Hamilton is frustrated, but Mercedes have decided that the radical change is going to come a little bit late. Like, they've just had the entire winter break to try and sort things out, to change things on the car, to try different setups. And yet, after one Grand Prix, Toto Wolff comes out and says, now is the time for radical change. Surely the time for radical change would have been at the end of the 2022 season, where that car didn't work for the entirety of the 2022 season. You can argue it got quicker and quicker, but then you could also argue that Ferrari kind of got slower over the course of the season. Red Bull had less to fight for, especially towards the end of the season, where Mercedes looked their best. Red Bull didn't really have too much to fight for anymore. And it sort of looked the same going into Bahrain, where Max Verstappen is turning down the engine power, Sergio Perez is turning down the engine power, and still nobody anywhere near him. Whereas many people were talking about Mercedes getting closer to that Red Bull car. George Russell even said after the Grand Prix, he thinks that Red Bull already have the title sewn up. So, like, when you're looking at George Russell, who is the young driver at Mercedes, is the driver that they seemingly want for the future, is kind of this driver that they're looking to build around once Lewis Hamilton starts to slowly decline, that's not a great stance for your main driver of the future to have already in this 2023 season, where with 22 races to go and a year of Formula One driving in front of him, he's already demotivated by the car that he is in. Then it's, where does Hamilton actually go? And I feel like this is where the rumors that circulate kind of fall down a little bit. Lewis Hamilton still has won 8 constructors titles with Mercedes back to back to back. Lewis Hamilton has still won 6 drivers championships with Mercedes again, sort of back-to-back Nico Rosberg in there as well. But they dominated that entire era of Formula One, and they did so incredibly well. So the links, therefore, are Hamilton to Ferrari, which is the first one that I've seen, which isn't impossible, although it was Simon Lazenby, who's not the most credible of people, who was coming out and kind of fueling the fire when it comes to that. I can see it happening in terms of like a driver to team kind of fit, you know what I mean? Feel like Lewis Hamilton being the driver that he is, Ferrari being the team that they are, kind of being in and around Formula One for so long and together, it always is going to come back to that, right? It's the possible best driver of all time and statistically the best team of all time. Can they come together in some way and make something happen, even if it is at the end of their career? Kind of like what we saw when Sebastian Vettel moved to Ferrari. There was big hype around that then, right? He was a 4-time world champion. He'd come from Red Bull. He was going to drag Ferrari back to the days of Michael Schumacher in the past. But it didn't quite happen with Sebastian Vettel. Could it happen with Lewis Hamilton? I don't think we'll ever see it. I think it would be fun to see what Lewis Hamilton could do at Ferrari, but I just don't think the puzzle pieces will ever quite fit together 100%. And then obviously it's Aston Martin, which are the second one. Where does Lewis Hamilton fit in there? Is it when Fernando Alonso retires? Fernando Alonso 41 right now, but Lewis Hamilton 38. Like, it's not like he is lots younger than Fernando Alonso. And if you think about kind of where they are in their Formula One careers, Fernando Alonso also had 2 years out of Formula One. So let's take that off and say that, you know, in terms of his racing ability and in terms of the sort of forces and pressure that have been put on his body, because he had those couple of years out, maybe he's in a little bit better of a place. He's more like a 39-year-old than a 41-year-old at this point, and therefore Lewis Hamilton slotting in to replace Fernando Alonso still doesn't feel very long-term for Aston Martin. And also then you've got Lance Stroll. There is no way that they're going to get Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso back together again. We saw that they were only together for a season at McLaren, and they still hate each other now because of that season at McLaren. That would not work in any way whatsoever, those two in the same Aston Martin team. So I just can't see the move to Aston Martin happening either. I think Lewis Hamilton is going to stay at Mercedes. Then the obviously final thing is Lewis Hamilton retiring. Does he decide to just leave Formula One in its entirety? I can see that happening. I feel like Lewis Hamilton is the kind of guy, a bit like what we saw with Sebastian Vettel last year. I think Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel, you can draw quite a lot of parallels between them. You know, Sebastian Vettel, the main reason he wanted to leave Formula One was his family. I suppose that Lewis Hamilton doesn't have that. But in terms of the other projects that they're working on, Sebastian Vettel working on various projects outside of Formula One that kind of synced up with his mindset and his thought process in that Formula One season as well. Lewis Hamilton has the same thing. Lewis Hamilton has so many projects on the sidelines where he could jump into one of those in a bit more detail, or he could go off and do something completely different, whether that's, you know, the fashion stuff that he does, the film stuff that he does. He has so many connections with so many incredible people. I'm sure he'd find something to fill his time with. But if he does still love Formula One, if he does still think that Mercedes can maybe get up there, you know, the 2026 regulations is what people are talking about now for Mercedes. Do they find a way back to the top before then? I don't think so. You know, it's easy to say, right, that Aston Martin have been able to make massive steps forward by looking at the Red Bull car and copying a few bits and pieces from that Red Bull car, which we'll delve into in a little bit later. But if you look at the Mercedes project, if Mercedes just go in right now, okay, say they completely scrap the design that they've got and they just decide to go in and be like, okay, we're going to take the Red Bull design as our core concept. You could either take Red Bull or Ferrari as kind of the core concepts that are available on the Formula One grid right now. Let's say that they take the Red Bull concept and they're like, right, we're going to sack off our zero pod, sack off that for what we've been working on for nearly 2 seasons now. We're just going to completely get rid of that and try this Red Bull setup. That still leaves you second at best, right? There's no way that they're going to be able to completely change their design, go to the Red Bull design, and then make it better than Red Bull already have it when Red Bull have been working with this design for 2 years already. It's just a really strange place for Lewis Hamilton to be right now. He's not going to be able to battle for victories in the way that he wants to. He's not going to be able to battle for that 8th World Championship in the way that he wants to. And maybe this is the time for Lewis Hamilton where if he can't see it happening, And if he doesn't really believe in the team moving into the new regulations in 2026 either, I feel like that's the final roll of the dice for Lewis Hamilton. Like, does he want to just stick around for 2 years to see what happens when it comes to 2026? That's the real question that Lewis Hamilton has to answer. And unfortunately, nobody else can answer that apart from Lewis Hamilton. But that's where I'm kind of at when it comes to Lewis Hamilton. Let's have a look at what you guys are saying in the chat. Even if Mercedes become competitive, Hamilton is going to have a tough time against Russell. That's very true. And I also feel like even if they do become competitive, Aston Martin look quick. Ferrari still have a very good, solid team and a good, solid car. And I don't think that they're going to be able to catch the Red Bulls anytime soon. The only benefit for Hamilton to Ferrari is the experience in the team, strategy, management. That's very true. I feel like Lewis Hamilton would be a great driver to come in and try and go sort of the next level with that Ferrari setup. We're going to talk about Ferrari a little bit later, actually. That's my second kind of big news story of the week. But Hamilton going in there, the experience that he has, again, multiple world champion. They seem to move away from that, though, Ferrari, right? You think of the Ferrari era where they brought in Vettel, Alonso. They went for these multiple world champions to kind of build upon. And then they decided to go in a different direction. They brought in Carlos Sainz, Charles Leclerc, these drivers that hadn't won world championships, hadn't even got wins in Formula One, between them. When Carlos Sainz moved over to Ferrari, he's got a podium to his name, no wins, no poles, no anything like that. They could have gone for another ex-world champion or another driver who's got loads of wins behind them. Maybe Daniel Ricciardo comes into Ferrari or something. I don't think he fits character-wise with the team, but you know what I mean? They could have gone for a driver who's won Grand Prix in the past, but they didn't. They decided to go in that different direction. And therefore, Hamilton doesn't really fit that mold unless they decide to flip-flop again and change back to the direction that they had beforehand. But that's just something that Ferrari will have to kind of answer themselves. Lewis wants that 8th title, even if it means sticking around forever. He'll probably wait the maximum 2-3 years. I could see, again, that happening because the thing is, Mercedes are never going to get rid of Lewis Hamilton, right? Lewis Hamilton has got like an infinite contract with Mercedes. I know that they kind of renew it every couple of years, but I feel like it's down to Lewis Hamilton more so than it's down to Mercedes as to when he gets that contract and how that contract looks, because they do want to keep hold of him. He has been the talisman of that team for so long now. And it's going to get to the point where if he does start to fall behind George Russell a little bit more often, I still think that Lewis Hamilton is the better of the two drivers right now that Mercedes have. But I could see there being a turning point where George Russell does overtake Lewis Hamilton at some point in the future. When that comes, then the Mercedes have kind of the character to say to Lewis, you know what, we're going to go the other direction now. We're going to start looking at George Russell being the main driver. And that kind of moves into my second one. Daniel should have joined Ferrari instead of McLaren. I mean, it pretty much, well, it could have been on the table, is all I'm saying. I just feel like when that silly season happened, we saw lots of drivers moving around. It does make you wonder whether Ferrari had Carlos Sainz as kind of their first choice, or whether they maybe talked to 3 or 4 different drivers, or, well, you'd assume that Ferrari would have done their due diligence, right, and talked to as many drivers as possible. And I feel like Daniel Ricciardo, at the time, he was absolutely storming it for Renault. Maybe they didn't want a driver to come in, upset the apple cart in the way that Daniel Ricciardo may have, because Daniel Ricciardo might have wanted to be a first driver somewhere, whereas Charles Leclerc is clearly their golden boy moving forward. It's a bit like going to Red Bull. If you know you're going to Red Bull, you're always going to kind of be that second driver. And that leads on quite nicely, actually. Lewis Hamilton possibly retiring, talking about Red Bull, talking about Ferrari and the seats that are available to them. Because the second driver who's already being talked about in this kind of silly season-ness is Lando Norris. Like, already we're seeing Lando Norris linked to many different teams. I think the main thing coming out of Bahrain was the fact that Lando Norris already seems incredibly frustrated with the inability for McLaren to move forwards, but also the mistakes that were made during the first Grand Prix. He even kind of joked after the Grand Prix. It was good pit stop practice for the mechanics, being forced to pit 6 times with a power unit issue in Bahrain. Like, he was not having the greatest of times, was Lando Norris. He really didn't enjoy the Bahrain Grand Prix whatsoever. And I feel like if you're Lando Norris right now, you're just lacking a little bit of direction. You're lacking a kind of understanding of where McLaren are really going to be in the next few seasons. Because as much as he's easily the number one at that team, right? And as much as he is the driver for McLaren right now, he is by far and away just the driver that McLaren want and have and want to hold on to for as long as they possibly can. At the same time, I think he is incredibly motivated to get the most out of his Formula One career. And he's looking at the past couple of seasons. He's looking at the fact that George Russell is now winning Grand Prix. Carlos Sainz is now winning Grand Prix. And he probably sees himself as on the level of those drivers. You know, you look at when he and Carlos were teammates in McLaren, they were pretty equally matched. And I would say that Lando Norris has improved since then. Has Carlos Sainz improved since then? I think is more questionable, but Lando Norris has definitely improved since then. So maybe Lando Norris sees himself as of the level of a Carlos Sainz, Charles Leclerc, George Russell. He's just seen George Russell win in Brazil. Would Lando Norris have been able to put in that same kind of performance? I think you could argue that he could if he was given the machinery that George Russell had on the day. Would Lando Norris have done similar, if not better? I think so. And therefore, he's probably starting to get frustrated a little bit with the setup at McLaren right now. There is still a little bit of hope. Let's look at the positives first, right? There is still a little bit of hope for McLaren moving forward. McLaren have got their new wind tunnel coming in 2024. They have got a new... They've got a new setup coming to their team, their testing team, in terms of their wind tunnel and their simulator. That's what the word I was looking for. Their simulator is also going to be built up for the 2024 season. There's still hope for McLaren that is going to get better, and they are trying to add a little bit to the infrastructure when it comes to the McLaren team as a whole. But at the same time, when it comes to all of those positives for McLaren, McLaren have been going backwards, I would argue, in the last 2 seasons. They just can't seem to adapt to the car that they've got right now, if you know what I mean. You know, when you look at them, 2019, yes, Ferrari had an incredibly off year and Sebastian Vettel just hated every single moment that he had in that car. But at the same time, Lando Norris, Carlos Sainz, they look settled in that team. They finished 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. It was all looking really, really good for McLaren moving forwards. And I think if you were a gambling person, or if you were a person thinking, okay, so when the new regulations come in 2022, maybe in 2023, if I offered you, you know, a £5 bet, I said one of these 3 is going to get on the podium in Bahrain in 2023. An Alpine, a McLaren, or an Aston Martin, 99% of people would have said, well, it's obviously going to be the McLaren, because Alpine was still looking a little bit 50-50. They were losing their driver in Daniel Ricciardo that they absolutely loved. Aston Martin were first coming into Formula One. They were still trying to find their feet. They were still making that transition from Racing Point. And Racing Point, even though they did get that victory, they were never looking like they were properly going to battle right at the top of the grid. McLaren were. McLaren looked like they had the foundation of that team now, where it had gone from that kind of McLaren-Honda era that was so incredibly bad. Seidel had come in, Zach Brown had come in, they'd gotten rid of the dead wood. Apologies to Stoffel Van Dorn, apologies to Fernando Alonso that it didn't work out there. I don't think Fernando Alonso's dead wood, but he kind of dragged the team down a little bit with his negativity. They changed it up completely. They got in Carlos Sainz, got in Lando Norris, and it looked like it was going so well. Now it's just fallen backwards, right? They finish in 3rd place. The next season, 2021, Ferrari are back, but McLaren looked like they could still hold on to 3rd place. They could still overcome Ferrari, even though the Ferrari car looks quick. But they aren't able to do so. The McLaren team eventually fall away. Ferrari are able to increase in their strategy, increase in their ability to just get the best out of that Ferrari car over the course of the 2021 season. And eventually McLaren fall down and come in 4th place. Then last season, okay, we're not battling in the top 3 anymore, but we've still got this battle with Alpine. Lando Norris is looking like easily the best of the rest driver out there. Maybe this season is where we can start to, even knock on the door of the top 3 and again, consolidate that 4th place finish. Again, it kind of comes towards the end of the season. We start to fall down a little bit. Alpine find a little bit more pace. Fernando Alonso gets a little bit less unlucky with some reliability issues. And again, Alpine then overcome and McLaren drop into 5th place. Now we're looking at this season. I know we're only 1 race into it, but the Bahrain Grand Prix was embarrassing for the McLaren team, for Lando Norris, for Oscar Piastri. Oscar Piastri's Formula One debut lasted 14, 15 laps. Lando Norris had to pit 6 times over the course of the Grand Prix. It doesn't quite work together. And now we're looking at, okay, Aston Martin look really, really strong. Alpine look really, really strong. And they were kind of the midfield battle that McLaren were hoping to be in and hoping to overcome. That just doesn't look like it's going to be the case now. Possibly Alpine, you would argue, but Aston Martin look in a completely different stratosphere to the McLaren team right now. And it looks like McLaren might end up coming 6th. So they've literally dropped a place in the constructor standings every single year since they kind of made Lando Norris that main driver. I know that when Daniel Ricciardo came in, it was maybe arguable that Lando Norris would have still been the second driver to Daniel Ricciardo. But I think now we can see that over the course of that 2020 and the 2021 season, 2022 season, Lando Norris clearly became the main driver of that team. Even with Daniel Ricciardo still there, Daniel Ricciardo was struggling and McLaren were trying to find a way to get rid of Daniel Ricciardo last year as well and bring in Oscar Piastri. Oscar Piastri is not going to take that number 1 role straight away from Lando Norris. So Lando Norris, I could see why he is thinking of other teams and sort of getting frustrated at McLaren. The positive for Lando Norris is that he is still clearly the number 1. If he wants to stay at McLaren, the team will do everything they possibly can for him. If he asks for this change in the car, that change in the car, that will be made for him. Whereas if you look at maybe other teams that he could go to, let's break that down a little bit. So there's 3 main teams that I've seen Lando Norris linked to. Obviously, if you're someone on the grid and Lando Norris is available, I think you should probably go and talk to him. But I think the 3 teams that he's been most linked to are Red Bull, because Christian Horner is a massive fan of Lando Norris. Although I can't personally see this happening. I think Max Verstappen wouldn't want Lando Norris to come into that team because he would want just still to be the clear number 1 driver. I think Lando Norris coming into that team could upset that a little bit for Max Verstappen. And also, I don't think that Lando Norris wants to go to a team where he's clearly a number 2. I think even if he came in, Red Bull would make it fairly clear that Max Verstappen is still their golden boy. Max Verstappen is still going to be their number 1 driver moving forward. Then secondly, I've seen Mercedes. I suppose with what we talked about earlier, Lewis Hamilton possibly leaving Mercedes in the next couple of years. Does Lando Norris go over there? Does he believe in the Mercedes car and the Mercedes build? Again, they've got George Russell. Do they prefer George Russell to Lando Norris, or do they just let it kind of battle out between them? We know that they don't mind having 2 British drivers. They've literally got 2 British drivers right now. Would we see kind of the next Lewis Hamilton, Nico Rosberg in George Russell and Lando Norris? Possibly. You know, they're good friends right now. Could we see that develop? And if Mercedes do give them a competitive car, do they allow those 2 to battle one another? Again, that's up to Lando Norris and whether or not Lando Norris wants to go there with that challenge and whether Mercedes want to kind of combat that whenever it does happen. And then finally, the 3rd team I've seen Lando Norris linked to, which I think is probably the most likely to happen, is Audi, right? He's going to link back up with Seidel, who's just gone over to the Audi team. On top of that, he gets to be the number 1 driver, you would say. You know, there isn't a Max Verstappen or George Russell already at that Sauber team. Valtteri Bottas might feel a little bit hard done by. He's kind of running that team right now. The Alfa Romeo, Sauber, Audi outfit looks like it is kind of Valtteri Bottas's for the next couple of years. Maybe if Lando Norris goes in there, Valtteri Bottas kind of still is that number 1, and Lando Norris maybe comes in, learns the ropes a little bit, but I feel like would displace Valtteri Bottas fairly quickly in their first season if they were to be together. I feel like Lando Norris would probably take the seat of Joe, and then Joe would move away from that team. Where he'd go, I don't really know, but I could see Lando Norris coming in. Does Lando Norris wait until 2026? Wait and see if Audi are actually good enough? I don't think so. I think if you're Lando Norris and you actually believe that Audi are going to be good, you believe the hype from Andreas Seidel and the various people around Formula One that Audi are going to be able to deliver, you want to get in there sooner rather than later. You kind of want to be able to imprint what you like about that car on the team as it's building up to be Audi, rather than coming in once it's already established. You know what I mean? Like, you kind of want to have that ability to lean a few bits and pieces in your direction just to favor you, so that when they do probably replace Valtteri Bottas in 2-3 years' time, they're looking like they want to bring in a German driver, Mick Schumacher, maybe Sebastian Vettel comes out of retirement, something along those lines for the Audi team, right? You've still got Lando Norris as kind of your main stalwart driver that you're building around for the future, and your driver that you're going to move into with the rest of this. And I don't know, I feel like Lando Norris moving is more likely than Lewis Hamilton moving for definite, but where he then goes is pretty tricky to answer for Lando. If he stays at McLaren, he's going to have to be incredibly patient, and he's also going to have to massively believe in that project. If he does move away from McLaren, I think the problem he's going to have is battling with teammates who have already been in the setup and have already kind of established themselves within those teams, or another risk, another gamble on another team that are trying to build their way up there. And we don't know whether that's going to really happen or not. You know, we've seen it with Aston Martin. They've shown that it can be done. But then we've also seen it with the likes of Renault coming back into Formula One. They said they were going to be battling for championships, and it never really happened. So you have to kind of be a bit 50-50 with these. And Lando Norris has got a big decision on his hands moving forwards. Charles and Lewis swap. Ooh, that would be interesting. That would be very interesting. I can't see Charles liking being in a Mercedes car, though. I feel like as much as he's probably a little bit annoyed at how it's gone with Ferrari so far, he probably does still like being in that Ferrari car. Hamilton's words: consistent up, showing, and talk. A bit like what you're doing when podcasting. His work on the sidelines is catwalking, paddock walks, grid walks, look at me walks. I mean, I feel like that's maybe a little bit harsh. We don't really know the ins and outs of what Lewis Hamilton does behind the scenes. Yeah, I can't see Lewis Hamilton leaving in the next couple of years. But I think it depends on how much he really, especially because he's been so critical of the team's direction recently. You know, maybe he gets even more annoyed with the team, just decides. Horner likes Ricciardo and Piastri more than Lando, I think. I think that's mainly because he still wants to keep Max Verstappen as the number one. I think it's easier to convince Daniel Ricciardo to be a number two, because Daniel Ricciardo would probably at this point just be happy to be back in Formula One and back to racing, and also has the possibility to add to those wins he already has in Formula One. I think Daniel Ricciardo might be at the point in his career now where he's kind of given up on titles, but still wants to have those victories and those moments that he can look back upon. A bit like Sergio Perez. I feel like Sergio Perez, as much as he kind of says he wants to battle for the title, he kind of knows that Max Verstappen is going to be the number one, but he still has the opportunity, because he's at Red Bull, to pick up victories, to pick up podiums, to pick up pole positions, and he still gets to kind of pad his cabinets at home with a few trophies here and there. Lando needs to go. He could gamble on Audi if Alonso pulls. Then he could also go for the Alonso seat. That's very true. I feel like Alonso isn't going to pull out in the next few seasons, though. And if Lando's going to gamble on Audi, I think it should be sooner rather than later. I feel like he has to kind of go in there, get his teeth into the team a little bit, and show that he can be the one to build around. Charles won't leave Ferrari until he wins a championship for them. The only reason he is there is for Jules. I mean, there's some big things you said there, but I understand what you're kind of going for, and the kind of emotion that has linked Charles Leclerc to Ferrari and the team. And obviously the fact that Ferrari also feel connected to Charles Leclerc as well. The fact that they've built this together, right? And Charles Leclerc's kind of been there from the early concepts that they were building up with. Lewis will only retire after one last championship. That's very true. I feel like that's the other thing, right? Will Lewis Hamilton just decide to leave once the championship has been won? We'll have to kind of wait and see. Shall we delve into Ferrari in a little bit more then? Because I think big news story number 2 that's kind of come out of this week is the fact that change is coming. Change is very much coming for the Ferrari team. So in terms of like what's been happening at Ferrari so far, it's either, is it good change or bad change? Is it good change or bad change? It's kind of what we need to talk about with Ferrari, right? So if you are unaware, Ferrari have made some big changes recently to their Formula One team. the biggest change that has come out this week, Ferrari's head of concept, David Sanchez, reportedly quits. So not even the fact that, they've come to an agreement. We usually see this with Ferrari, right? It's like, Matteo Binotto and the team have come to an agreement that maybe they shouldn't really work together anymore. And I think that's more Ferrari leading them away. This is Ferrari's head of concept quits and is set to move to McLaren. He is not happy with something going on in the team, and therefore he has decided to make that change for himself. Now, it's whether or not that is the instability or the change that is actually needed, right? Does this show that Ferrari are just in a position again where they're so unstable that they can't really understand what's happening with their car, and the people in and around it that feel like they're going to get the blame are just like, I'm going to jump ship before anything massively happens here? Or is it the other way around, where this is Vasseur coming in, the change that is needed within that Ferrari team that everybody has been talking about for recent years, right? The fact that they've had so many reliability issues, so many technical issues, so many strategy issues, so many behind the scenes issues with that team, like leading all the way back to the Sebastian Vettel days. You could argue when Sebastian Vettel was supposed to be battling for championships, there was still that underlying current of negativity and unsure and unassertiveness. Is this the change that they really need? Is Vasseur finally going to be the one to come in? Let's kind of delve into it, right? So David Sanchez was the head of the vehicle concept, an incredibly respected member of the Ferrari team, in a similar vein to Matteo Binotto, I would say. David Sanchez been there for a very long time. I think he moved to Ferrari in 2012 from the McLaren team. So it's also interesting that he's going back to the team that he came from. He is now going to be on gardening leave. And there was quite a lot of talk around it where when Charles Leclerc was told that David Sanchez was going to be leaving, he wasn't very happy about it. So I think that's the thing, right? The Ferrari team, this doesn't seem like something many people would have wanted to happen, but maybe Vasseur coming in, maybe this is the shakeup that Ferrari didn't want to happen, but need to happen. Because if you look at kind of Red Bull, Mercedes, you look at Christian Horner, Toto Wolff, it feels like they have been there forever, right? It just feels like they are part of Formula One now. And if you saw the Red Bull team without Christian Horner, well, literally it didn't exist before Christian Horner. So it'd be so incredibly strange to see anybody else in that position. I feel like it's kind of the same with Toto Wolff and Mercedes, right? They brought in Toto Wolff very early on in that project. Obviously, I know that it was kind of adapted from other teams, various bits and pieces. And Toto Wolff has kind of been, again, that figure. On top of Lewis Hamilton, I would say that if you ask, the second person they will mention is Toto Wolff. Toto Wolff is so synonymous with that Mercedes brand at this point. Ferrari haven't been able to do that. Ferrari haven't really been able to get themselves in this position where they are comfortable with the team principle that they have and the direction that they seem to be going in. And I think it was very interesting, actually, that Vasseur, after the Bahrain Grand Prix, said that the new Ferrari car needed a full investigation into Leclerc's DNF in Bahrain. Like, he was very, very unhappy with how this had gone for the Ferrari team. And he said that he doesn't issue any blame to Charles Leclerc, obviously, but he does want to find out what happened, why it happened, and where they can sort of find blame almost within the team, which is a very different aspect to what we've seen in Ferrari in the past. A very different take on the Ferrari team to what we have seen in the past. It's something that if you told me that Matteo Binotto had said that, I just wouldn't believe you. Matteo Binotto last year, every single time there was a mistake or a problem or something went wrong for Ferrari, Matteo Binotto basically said, nope, that's not the case. That is just not the case. Something, was out of our control. It was just the tires. It was just this. It was just that. Matteo Binotto found excuses where I think Vasseur is trying to find problems and get rid of them. And therefore, it feels quite arriva bene, to be honest with you. It feels like Ferrari are flip-flopping between team principles that are too strict, too hard on the team, and maybe are a little bit too cutthroat, to too soft in Matteo Binotto, too lenient, too easygoing, too laid back. And there's maybe a middle ground that needs to be found here. Is Vasseur going to be that middle ground? From that first quote, I feel like he's definitely on the Arriva Bene side more so than the Binotto side of how he's going to act with the team behind the scenes. But at the same time, maybe he's not going to be as harsh as Arriva Bene. Maybe he's not going to be so cutthroat and so dictatorly within that Ferrari team. It's going to be interesting to see which way he goes with it, right? But it's good to know that he's being proactive. It's good to know that he can combat some of these issues and that he's willing to kind of take the blame a little bit. Willing to be like, okay, we're going to find out what went wrong. We're going to work together as a team. If you don't want to be part of that, if you don't want to be held accountable for what you are doing within this Ferrari team, maybe this Ferrari team isn't for you. And I feel like that's where he's really come in. And maybe, this is massive speculation from me, obviously, but maybe that's what David Sanchez didn't like. The fact that the team was going in this different direction. I know that David Sanchez was there under Arriva Bene, but maybe he hated it under Arriva Bene, right? Maybe he was just sticking around with Ferrari because he thought that maybe he could do something special with that Ferrari team. You know, Ferrari is an institution at this point. So maybe David Sanchez just held around for that. And actually, because he knew that Binotto was kind of going to come in, many people, especially towards the kind of last year of Arriva Bene, knew that Binotto was going to kind of be that man, and maybe was that man behind the scenes more so because Binotto had a lot of infrastructure around him at Ferrari and also had a lot of help in building that Ferrari car, even when he wasn't specifically the team principal. So maybe, you know, David Sanchez was working with Binotto. Now that Binotto has gone, Vasseur has come in. He can kind of see the parallels that maybe this is going to be a little bit tougher than it was with Binotto. Maybe I'm going to be held accountable for more stuff. And maybe he didn't want that. Again, that's massive speculation for me. I don't know David Sanchez well. I don't know him personally. I don't know whether he'd absolutely love a team boss that is going to hold him accountable. You know, some people do and some people don't. I personally need that. If I'm working in a team, I need somebody to tell me when I'm doing something wrong. Like I'm one of those people that doesn't want an arm around the shoulder. I almost want to be told what I'm doing, where it's happening. An arm around the shoulder when I've done it correct is exactly what I need. Maybe David Sanchez isn't one of those characters. He needs that arm around the shoulder all of the time. He needs the help, the guidance, the, you know, positive reinforcement all of the time. And you're not going to get that with Vasseur. So change is definitely coming to Ferrari. Whether or not that change can be so dramatic enough to actually get the Ferrari team to where they want to be, we'll kind of have to wait and see. It's only one race into Vasseur. It's only, 2 months since he's joined the team. He joined the team in January. So he's still trying to find his feet a little bit within this Ferrari setup. It's going to be really tough for him because a lot of the people that have worked for Ferrari have been, first and foremost, Italian with the Italian team. You know, Arriva Bene, Binotto, all of those guys before him were Italian. Coming in as a Frenchman into this Italian team, he's going to have to try something a little bit different. I know that he's worked in and around with Ferrari because of his links with Alfa Romeo and the engine supplier, and he obviously gets on incredibly well with Binotto. He talked to Binotto before the season had even started. He'd also talked to Gunther Steiner, who is also powered by Ferrari. You know, there's definitely links with Vasseur, and he's very, very confident in his abilities. But I think the fact that he is an outsider, he is somebody coming into the Ferrari team. He's not a Binotto that's worked there for 20 years. He's not an Arriva Bene that had been in and around the company and worked with various people at Ferrari for those preceding years. He has come in. He is now the number one, and maybe he's a little bit cutthroat. And maybe he's going to actually finally make those changes. And if he's given the kind of go-ahead, especially by the guys above him, because I think that's the thing with Ferrari, right? It's always seen as, is it actually the team principal or is it a problem that is higher up? He needs that backing from the guys that are higher up to be able to be like, we're going to get rid of these people. We're going to completely just chuck away this and we're going to go for something else. And I feel like that's where Vasseur could really shine as the team principal. The middle ground between Jean Todt and Domenicali. Yes, exactly. He needs to be, again, it just needs to be that middle ground somewhere between the two, right? The screen keeps freezing. Oh, that's annoying. Can I see? Oh, yeah, I am dropping frames. Why am I dropping frames? Not sure. It shouldn't be freezing. Thank you for pointing that out, though. Apologies. It's always, you know, the first one of any season, it's always going to have some ups and downs. It's always going to have some tricky things going on. Car blows up, Binotto is calm. It did feel like that at times last season. It felt like he just didn't really want to take any responsibility, did he, Binotto? He was just kind of like, well, let's not take anything too seriously. And then it'll all just be fine. It'll all just work itself out, right, guys? And then everyone was like, the Ferrari keeps falling apart, and you're supposed to be battling for a championship. And Binotto was like, nah, it'll all be good. It'll all be fine. All right, final news story of the week. The imitation game. Have I spelled imitation right there? Imitation. Should I double check? I've just looked at it now, and it just looks wrong. Imitation. Also a great film. Is it The Imitation Game? That film? Yeah, it's the Benedict Cumberbatch one, right? Imitation. Yeah, I think that's spelled right. We'll stick with it. We'll go with it. All right, final kind of big news story. Or not really. It's not even... you could argue this was like this week / end of last week. If you run Sunday to Sunday, it's this week. The previous week of Formula One, Christian Horner has come out and thrown some shade at the Aston Martin team. Well, a little bit of shade. Basically, what Christian Horner said was, he said it was good to see the old car going so well. You know what I mean? I feel like it's a little bit of shade, but also just kind of also flattering to see that, right? Because he was asked about, obviously, Fallows going to the team. Do you regret losing Fallows? He said no, because I think it's a wonderful team and everything has to evolve. Nothing stands still. I think it's flattering to see the resemblance of that car to ours. So it's great to see 3 of them on the podium. Demonstrates that all teams have that ability to catch up. They've obviously done a good job over the winter. They say imitation is the best form of flattery. Good to see the old car going so well, as I said before. And Sergio Perez also joined in. Nice to see 3 Red Bull cars on the podium. And then when he questioned Fernando and the Red Bull drivers, Sergio Perez said, we're all Red Bull drivers. So the Red Bull team certainly have a little bit of an agenda. At least, well, Christian Horner and Sergio Perez have a little bit of an agenda when talking to the press at the moment, and want to just make sure that everyone is clear that the Aston Martin picking up a podium, Red Bull have, been poking fun a little bit at their new competitors. They're the new kid on the block, right? They're the new kid in school. They've decided that they're going to burst into the top 3 all of a sudden. They're going to displace Ferrari or Mercedes and be on the podium with the Red Bulls. So it's now starting to be, Christian Horner poking fun at that other team. We saw it with Christian Horner poking fun at Toto Wolff. We didn't really see it too much with Christian Horner poking fun at Binotto. Maybe you didn't really see him as too much of a threat. I feel like that's when you kind of know when a team principal like Toto Wolff, like Christian Horner, really sees you as a threat, is when they start to kind of jab you a little bit, poke you a little bit, and see if they can get a reaction out of you. You know what I mean? Like, Christian Horner doesn't talk this way about Franz Tost. That's a bad choice because he's obviously at AlphaTauri. He doesn't talk this way about Gunther Steiner. You never really see Christian Horner and Gunther Steiner really battling it out. You know what I mean? Christian Horner never makes a horrible little remark about Gunther Steiner, but he will about Toto Wolff. He will about Toto Wolff. Even when Mercedes are having a bad season like last year, Christian Horner would still put in those digs at Toto Wolff because he still sees him as a clear competitor at points. So when you're doing well is when Christian Horner starts to talk about you a little bit more. So I feel like Aston Martin can take this as a little bit of a compliment that Christian Horner is talking about it, poking fun at them, and Sergio Perez is joining in as well. You could see that as a compliment as an Aston Martin fan. Fallows, who was the number 2 to Adrian Newey, for those of you that don't know, moved over to Aston Martin because last year, Aston Martin clearly weren't happy with their 2022 car, right? So we saw in the first few races of the season, they were absolutely terrible. And therefore, they decided to completely change up what they were doing. They decided to go in a more Red Bull style direction. You know, it was Spain, wasn't it? They came in, they had the new car, and everyone was like, wow, this car looks a lot like the Red Bull. Are you sure you haven't just copied the Red Bull? And Aston Martin proved that they had, you know, the renders there, they had the facilities there, and they showed the FIA that they didn't just copy the Red Bull. They had this design of their own, and they were absolutely happy with it. Then it was interesting that Aston Martin also went and got Dan Fallows, as I mentioned before, because he was the chief, or the second aerodynamicist at Red Bull. They were going in this Red Bull direction, and then they pick up Dan Fallows, who obviously also has lots and lots of ideas around the Red Bull team, and clearly guided the aerodynamic setup that the Aston Martin has for this season, right? I'm not saying that they have copied. I don't think they have copied. But you can see that there has been ideas that Dan Fallows probably came up with at Red Bull. Like, I know that we talk about Adrian Newey as this like god of Formula One, and he does an exceptional job at the team. Don't get me wrong. Like, Adrian Newey is by far and away one of the most special minds we are ever going to see in Formula One. But he does still have that team around him. And you can't say that Dan Fallows didn't come up with some of the design concepts that Red Bull may have been running on their car. I feel like Dan Fallows has just taken what he already came up with and some bits and pieces that other colleagues at Red Bull would have helped him to correct and design and help with right along the way. And he's just brought all of that information, that knowledge in his head that you can't stop him from having. You know, you can't stop him from having seen stuff in the past. And he's taken that idea and brought it over to the team that he is now, you know, the aerodynamic chief of. If he wants to kind of go for a car that he's comfortable in working with, it makes sense that he's got a similar car to what he was working with before, because he had the ideas and some of the design concepts around that too. So I just thought it was quite interesting that, you know, Christian Horner kind of threw this shade. Maybe it's a little bit of a positive actually for Aston Martin that they are getting talked about by Christian Horner, that they are getting talked about as a copy of the Red Bull car. Then it's kind of like, okay, so if they do, or if they have copied, is it then, you know, if they have copied the design from Red Bull, is it then they can only ever get to second best? Because if you copy a design of somebody, like completely copy it, and you're just copying what they do, you're always one step behind, right? So are Aston Martin just going to always be one step behind Red Bull? Or the fact that now Fallows has gone over, are they now going to try and innovate from this point forward? You know, if we are saying they just copied, are they going to now push forward in a different direction, or in a slightly different direction, which can overcome the Aston Martin team? Because I think the final thing that I kind of saw from this was that quote from Fernando Alonso: "This is just the beginning. There's more to come from himself and Aston Martin." They were the kind of key words from Fernando Alonso coming out of that first Grand Prix. He clearly feels like, even though they've got this concept right now, which is very, very close to the Red Bull car, that's saying this is just the beginning. Whilst Red Bull are looking to improve on an already winning car, Aston Martin now have that hunger, they have that desire, and they've been given a little bit of that, right? They've been given a crumb of the cookie, you know, a podium in the first race of the season. It's not a championship. It's not a constructors' championship. It's not even a win. But they've been given, you know, a little bit of the chocolate chip that makes up the entire cookie that you need to win Formula One championships. And that's going to really give them an incentive going forward, right? I think if you're Aston and you want to close the gap, it's going to get very, very spicy. Probably not between Mike Crack and Christian Horner. As I said, you know, Christian Horner always digs out the likes of Toto Wolff. But I feel like this could be Fernando Alonso versus Christian Horner. Can I pose that to you? Christian Horner and Fernando Alonso going backwards and forwards in media, going backwards and forwards in press conferences. Like, could we see a driver and team principal. just a one-off where it's Christian Horner and Fernando Alonso in a room together talking to the media, maybe after an Aston Martin win where they controversially beat out a Red Bull, or maybe there's some contact between Fernando Alonso and Max Verstappen. Like, that's where we're getting to, right? If Fernando Alonso and Aston Martin do believe that this is just the beginning, they do believe they can close the gap on that Red Bull, even if they have taken a little bit of what the Red Bull already has, they feel like they can then improve on it. The fact that Christian Horner is already talking about them doesn't bode well for the future, when Christian Horner is going to have to talk about them even more, and talk about them possibly in a slightly more negative tone. You know, he made a couple of little digs, but he didn't go all out in the same way that you've maybe seen him go at Mercedes in the past. He was still fairly complimentary of the Aston Martin team. When does that turn? When does it turn around for Horner and it becomes, you know, from complimentary with a little dig to actually, we're really not happy with how Aston Martin are coming in and taking wins away from us, taking points away from us, and possibly fighting for champions with us in the future. Like, that's the turning point that I'm really excited to see, and I'm hoping that Aston Martin can get there. In terms of whether or not they've imitated the Red Bull car, I think, you know, you can say that they've taken a massive amount of inspiration, but I feel like that's as far as it can go. It's inspiration from the Red Bull car. You've still got the Aston Martin team have done an incredible job over the winter, have done an incredible job to build the new factory, the facility. As a McLaren fan, I am so incredibly impressed with how how Aston Martin have been able to make those steps forward. You can argue that they've got an incredible amount of money behind them. You can argue that, you know, even with the cost cap, the rest of the stuff that doesn't come under the cost cap, they've been able to just pump in an insane amount of money to. But having said that, I'm very, very impressed with Aston Martin, and I feel like they will be battling for championships very, very soon. Alonso's going to go Sigma on Horner if that happens. I feel like those two would be a really, really entertaining battle. You know, Fernando Alonso makes a dig at Christian Horner. Christian Horner says that Aston Martin have just copied the Red Bull and they're not actually their own team, blah, blah, blah. Then Fernando Alonso just holds like a winning trophy, maybe next to Christian Horner. You know, Fernando Alonso is a petty, petty human being, and he loves playing the villain. Christian Horner is a petty, petty human being that loves playing the villain. It's almost going to be like two villainous rivals going together. It's not like we're going to not side with one of them. Nobody is going to like Fernando Alonso or Christian Horner, but everybody is going to want to watch everything that they do together. You know what I mean? Everyone's going to want to watch the back and forth between those two. Very long since I came back to the channel. No worries, mate. No worries. Hello, hello. Controversial. Colin Chapman over Adrian Newey. Now, that's something we could delve into. They had Dan Fallows on their team. Wasn't Martin Wishmott also on Aston Martin now? Yeah, he's doing some bits and pieces behind the scenes for Aston Martin as well, isn't he? It's all a bit weird at Aston Martin. All a bit weird. Final little bit then. For me, anyway, today. I feel like I've gone on a little bit longer than I wanted to. Bada bing! No. Wait, what? Bada bing? There we go. Final thing I just wanted to show you was the Las Vegas renders look incredible. The Las Vegas renders look incredible. These have come out this week. If you haven't managed to see them, they just make the track. They make me so excited about what is going to happen for the future of this Grand Prix, and whether or not we're going to see like this exact thing. It's given me kind of Singapore, Saudi Arabia street circuit vibes. Obviously, they are two fairly new street circuits on the Formula One calendar. In particular, Saudi Arabia, obviously really, really new to the Formula One calendar. But just look at this building. The little Formula One logo on the top, this massive globe thing in the background, some kind of lights beaming out into the darkness of the night. This would just be a really, really fun Grand Prix. I'm massively, massively looking forward to the Las Vegas Grand Prix now. I was like 50-50 on it. You know, another American Grand Prix. Is it going to be as good as Austin? I really like the Austin Grand Prix, but like looking at some of these renders, it makes me want to go. I can't afford to go in any way imaginable. Like, this is going to cost some big bucks. But if I could go, it would be absolutely amazing. But that's just my thoughts and feelings on everything that's kind of happened this week in Formula One. Other business, 2026 power unit rumors. We might delve into that a little bit more in a couple of weeks' time when that's kind of fleshed out. It's just over the last couple of days, McLaren have been talking about a possible link up with Red Bull after they were linked with Honda as well. James Vowles has said that Williams will decide on their engine manufacturer moving forward this year, but it hasn't actually hinted at what that will be or whether or not it will be Mercedes or not again. Apart from Mercedes, everyone's been fairly positive. Everyone's fairly happy with how Bahrain went, and there's lots of positivity around the Formula One grid right now, as there should be after one race of the season. I think there's a lot to come still in Formula One this year. I think there's still an incredible amount that could go right or wrong for lots and lots of these teams, but that's where I'm going to leave it today, because we're getting live for an hour. And we've talked about kind of the main chunks of things that you need to know about going into the next race in a week's time. We will be live for qualifying and the race in Saudi Arabia as well. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you leave a like on this